So if you like 1911s, you're going to like this. This is pretty cool. This is a 6-inch 1911 slide. But the reason this one is so cool is because this did not start off as a 6-inch slide. I'm not sure who the original manufacturer is of this slide. It could be a Colt or an Essex. It's unmarked, but it's a very old slide. This slide is one of the very first 6-inch guns in the world. They did not make 6-inch 1911s until probably the early 60s. And my grandfather, Jim Clark Sr., was actually the originator of the 6-inch 1911 slide. He owned and opened Clark Custom Guns in 1950, and in the early 60s, they came up with this idea. So there's a couple cool things about this slide. One, if you look inside, I'll see if I can get some light in here, you'll see 2 bushing slot tabs. That's how you can confirm that it was definitely a 5-inch slide, and it had another tip of another slide welded onto the end. So you can see those 2 bushing slot tabs in there. So the way they made these was they would start off with the original 5-inch slide, and then my grandfather bought, like, I think it was a whole drum, like a 55-gallon drum of, I don't remember if it was GI slides or scrap slides that had been decommissioned, but he had a whole drum of them. And they cut the last inch of them off and used all of those scrap slides to do their conversions on 6-inch guns. So if you're lucky enough to have an early Clark 6-inch gun, I'll give you a little bit of Clark history here. On the disconnector track right here, there'll be some numbers. There'll be usually the last 3 digits of the serial number is towards the back of the slide, and towards the front, you'll have 3 digits, and that will be the month and the year that the gun was built. This one, you can barely make it out. It's 669. So this was in 1969 is when this gun came through Clark's the first time. Now, I didn't start working at Clark's until 2004. That's when I started. So I came to be in possession of this slide because the gun came in for a tune-up at some point. Who knows? Maybe in the 80s and the 90s, early 2000s. I'm not sure. But I came across this slide in the shop, and it was cracked. And you'll see this weld right here. You can see the discoloration. You can also see the discoloration right here. If you look really closely, whoever welded this the first time did a really good job, because there's no pitting. Right there, there's a little discoloration. And that's from the metal getting tempered from the weld. It got really hot. So I came across this slide, and it was cracked right through here. And the reason it was cracked is because these old 1911 Smiths, and even up until into the 2000s when I was working at Clark's, the gun would come in for a tune-up, and the way you would tune them up is you would put the slide in a hydraulic press, and we would just squeeze it. There was nothing scientific about it. You would squeeze it, and you had a little dial indicator that would tell you how far the metal was moving. But it was always kind of a guessing game, and you had to really feel it out because there was no set number. The metal could go in 10 thousandths, and then it would spring back out. Well, then you have to push it 12 thousandths, and it would spring back out, maybe to the exact same location that it originally was. And eventually you would squeeze it in to where that metal would find a new home and take a seat and sit there and stay squeezed in. But it's a really fine line between squeezing that metal in to take a seat and find a new home and cracking the slide. And it was, every single one I ever did was very tense. Squeezing slides, and it was rough. That was a really, really rough job. And so this one just went too far. Who knows why? They either pressed it too hard, or maybe the metal was weak. There's any number of reasons it could have cracked. So it cracked right here, so it had to be replaced, and this just stayed in the shop for a long time, and I came across it. When I found it, I actually welded it up here and then recut the serrations. But if you look, this one is hand engraved. Get some light on it there. Hand engraved Clark Long Heavy Slide 45, Shreveport, LA. So Clark's originally opened in Shreveport, and then they moved to Keithville in the 80s, I think. and then their final home is in Princeton, Louisiana. So this is a Shreveport gun, and there's not many of these out there. You know, a 60s model Clark Custom gun is pretty cool. So eventually, when I have free time, I'm going to build this back to its original spec and have a 45 ACP long heavy slide 1969 Papal Special. So the reason they started making 6-inch guns was because bullseye and accuracy in shooting groups was the name of the game back in the day. It was a very popular sport, bullseye shooting. And when you're shooting a pistol, the further apart your sights are, or the further your sight radius is, the more accurately, more precisely you can aim the gun. It doesn't matter if you have a 1-inch gun at 50 yards. If you don't have precise sights, or if they're really close together, you're not going to be able to aim that gun and shoot that gun as effectively and as accurately. So the gun can be as accurate, the most accurate gun in the world. If you can't aim the gun accurately or precisely, it's not going to do you any good. So a 5-inch gun, which I have here, compared to the 6-inch slide, it's an inch longer, just as you'd suspect. So there was several ways to achieve a longer sight radius. They used to, I think they silver soldered some really, really long extensions on the front of guns. So you'd have your front sight hanging off about an inch or more off your muzzle. And so you'd get a 6-inch sight radius that way. But the guns look really silly. You had to have a special bushing wrench to loosen your bushing, because it had a big old sight hanging off there. You couldn't get to the bushing. So that was not a great idea. It worked, but this was a much cleaner, much better option for extending that sight radius. So the downside of a 6-inch gun is that it's heavy and longer. You're adding about 1 inch of steel to the barrel and the slide. So that equates to quite a bit of weight on the end of the gun. And if you're into action shooting or fast follow-up shots, a 6-inch slide can feel a little bit chunk when you're shooting it. Now, for 99% of the people out there, when they pull the trigger, the gun goes bang. It all happens so fast, they don't really realize, or they can't feel the difference. But if you're a seasoned shooter and you're really in tune with your equipment, a 6-inch gun can feel a little bit chunk when you're shooting. So something else that's pretty cool, when they were developing this long slide, they started doing some testing on accuracy and the effects of lengthening the slide and barrel, of what that did to the groups. And you're shooting a 45 ACP, so it's a pretty slow bullet, relatively speaking. And I think there's somewhere around 6 3/4 inches to 7 inches when they noticed the groups just started opening up. And the reason for that was the 45 ACP bullet's pretty slow, so it's traveling through the barrel, and that barrel had started to unlock and come out of battery before that bullet exited the barrel. And so if your barrel starts to unlock before that bullet leaves, you're going to have terrible groups. So that's just a little bit of history and information about 6-inch 1911 slides.